They say money can't buy love, but what happens when you discover that without your money, there was no love to begin with? My name is Marcus, and at 68 years old, I learned the hardest lesson of my life on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my daughter's life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Cedar Ridge as I stood at my kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. 23 years I had been waking up in this house, 17 of them alone since Margaret passed. The silence had become my companion, broken only by the occasional call from my daughter Jessica or the familiar sounds of my neighbor's rooster announcing another day in our small Virginia town. My hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug, feeling the slight tremor that had developed over the past few years. Age had a way of creeping up, marking its territory with aches and limitations I never saw coming. But my mind remained sharp, especially when it came to numbers and the careful management of the small fortune I'd accumulated over decades of hard work in the construction industry. Marcus Construction had been more than just a business to me. It had been my legacy, my way of providing for Margaret and Jessica, and later, my method of ensuring my family never wanted for anything. Even after selling the company 5 years ago, the investments and savings continued to grow, a testament to the discipline Margaret and I had instilled in our financial planning. The phone rang, interrupting my morning routine. Jessica's name flashed on the screen, bringing the familiar mix of joy and apprehension that had characterized our relationship since her engagement to Trevor 6 months ago. "Good morning, sweetheart," I answered, settling into my favorite armchair, the leather worn smooth from years of use. "Dad, I need to talk to you about the wedding." Jessica's voice carried that particular tone I'd grown to recognize, the one that usually preceded a request for money. "Trevor and I have been looking at venues, and we found the perfect place." I listened as she described the Grandview Estate, a sprawling property overlooking the Shenandoah Valley, complete with gardens, a historic mansion, and accommodations for 200 guests. The excitement in her voice was infectious, reminding me of the little girl who used to spin in circles wearing her mother's old dress, dreaming of her fairy tale wedding. "It sounds beautiful, Jessica. What's the timeline looking like?" I asked, though I suspected where this conversation was heading. "That's the thing, Dad. We need to put down a deposit by the end of the week to secure the date, and the total cost is $45,000. She paused, and I could hear Trevor's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. We were hoping you might be able to help us with the venue costs. Trevor's parents are handling the catering and flowers, and his aunt owns a bakery, so the cake is covered." $45,000. The number settled in my mind without causing the financial anxiety it might have triggered in other families. Years of careful saving and investing had left me comfortable enough to afford such expenses without significantly impacting my retirement security. More importantly, this was Jessica's wedding, the daughter I'd raised alone after Margaret's death, the child who had been my whole world through some of the darkest periods of my life. "Of course, sweetheart. Send me the venue contact information, and I'll handle the deposit today," I replied, feeling the warmth that came with being able to provide for my daughter's happiness. The relief in Jessica's voice was palpable. "Oh, Dad, thank you so much. You're the best. Trevor and I were so worried we'd have to choose something smaller, but this place is exactly what we've dreamed of." After ending the call, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, thinking about Margaret and how proud she would have been to see Jessica getting married. Our daughter had grown into a successful marketing manager in Richmond, independent and driven, though perhaps a bit spoiled by my inability to say no to her requests over the years. Since Margaret's death, I'd struggled with the balance between being supportive and being overindulgent, often erring on the side of generosity. By noon, I'd transferred $15,000 to Grandview Estate as a deposit, speaking directly with the events coordinator, Mrs. Patricia Whitman. She assured me that the remaining $30,000 would be due 2 weeks before the wedding date, and I made a note in my calendar to handle that payment as well. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of wedding preparations. Jessica called frequently, updating me on dress fittings, menu tastings, and the growing guest list. Each conversation seemed to include another expense she hadn't anticipated, and each time I found myself reaching for my checkbook or initiating another bank transfer. There was the photographer she absolutely had to have, a renowned artist from Charleston whose fee was $8,000. The string quartet for the ceremony cost another $3,000. Jessica's dress, a custom creation from a boutique in Richmond, required alterations that somehow totaled nearly as much as the dress itself. When she mentioned needing help with the honeymoon expenses, I quietly arranged for a generous gift card to cover their planned trip to Italy. Trevor, my future son-in-law, remained largely absent from these financial discussions. A software developer with a good salary, he seemed content to let Jessica handle the wedding planning while he focused on his career. The few times I'd interacted with him during family dinners, he'd been polite but distant, more interested in his phone than in getting to know me better. I attributed this to the generational gap and the natural nervousness that comes with joining a new family. Margaret's sister Helen lived in Richmond, and she occasionally provided updates on the wedding preparations from her perspective. During one of our weekly phone calls, she mentioned something that stuck with me. "Marcus, I hope you know how much everyone appreciates what you're doing for Jessica's wedding," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern I couldn't quite interpret. "What do you mean, Helen?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "Well, the way some people talk, you'd think this wedding was happening without any contribution from the groom's family. I just hope Jessica and Trevor understand the sacrifice you're making." Her words planted a seed of doubt that I tried to dismiss. Jessica was my only child, and I had the means to give her the wedding she wanted. What else would I spend my money on? The house was paid off, my needs were simple, and making my daughter happy seemed like the most worthwhile investment I could make. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made the final payment to Grandview Estate, bringing my total contribution to the venue to $45,000. When I included the photographer, musicians, dress alterations, and honeymoon fund, I'd invested over $60,000 in ensuring Jessica's perfect day. The wedding invitation arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday, elegantly printed on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. As I opened it, I felt the pride that comes with seeing your child's name formally announcing such an important milestone. But as I read through the details, something caught my attention that I initially dismissed as a printing error. Under the traditional line, "Mr. and Mrs. Robert Harrison request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son, Trevor Robert Harrison, to Jessica Marie Caldwell," there was no mention of my name as the bride's father. In most wedding invitations I'd seen over the years, both sets of parents were typically listed, especially when one parent was hosting or significantly contributing to the event. I called Jessica that evening to ask about the invitation. "Oh, Dad, that's just the traditional format Trevor's mom wanted to use," she explained quickly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "It doesn't mean anything. Everyone knows you're walking me down the aisle and that you're, making the wedding possible." Her reassurance felt hollow, but I pushed aside my concerns. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive, reading too much into wedding invitation etiquette that had probably changed since Margaret and I were married 35 years ago. The final week before the wedding brought an unexpected challenge. Trevor's bachelor party, originally planned as a weekend camping trip, had evolved into an expensive excursion to Las Vegas. When Jessica called in tears, explaining that Trevor couldn't afford the trip and his friends were pressuring him to participate, I found myself once again reaching for my checkbook. "It's $5,000, Dad. I know it's a lot, but Trevor's really embarrassed, and his best man is being a real jerk about it. I just want him to be happy going into our wedding," Jessica pleaded. $5,000 for a bachelor party seemed excessive to me, but the distress in my daughter's voice overrode my practical objections. I transferred the money that afternoon, bringing my total wedding-related expenses to over $65,000. As the wedding day approached, I found myself experiencing a mix of excitement and melancholy. Walking Jessica down the aisle would be one of the most significant moments of my life, a bittersweet milestone that Margaret would have treasured. I spent extra time preparing my father of the bride speech, wanting to honor both Jessica's mother's memory and celebrate the beginning of my daughter's married life. The rehearsal dinner took place at a country club in Richmond, hosted by Trevor's parents. It was my first opportunity to spend extended time with the Harrison family and their friends. Robert Harrison owned several car dealerships across Virginia, and from the conversations I overheard, the family was well established in Richmond's business community. During the cocktail hour, I found myself standing alone near the bar, watching Jessica laugh with her bridesmaids across the room. She looked radiant, glowing with the happiness that every father hopes to see in his daughter. But as I observed the social dynamics around me, I began to notice patterns that made me uncomfortable. Trevor's friends and family members seemed to share an easy camaraderie that didn't extend to me. When I attempted to join conversations, responses were polite but brief, with attention quickly shifting back to topics and people I wasn't connected to. I overheard one Trevor's groomsman mention something about Jessica's old man paying for everything, followed by laughter that didn't feel entirely good-natured. Robert Harrison approached me during dinner, extending his hand with a smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. "Marcus, good to finally spend some time with you. Trevor tells me you're retired from construction?" "Yes, I sold my company a few years ago. Been enjoying a slower pace of life," I replied, hoping this would be the beginning of a meaningful conversation with my daughter's future father-in-law. "That's nice. Must be nice to have that flexibility," Robert said, glancing around the room as if looking for someone more interesting to talk to. "Well, I should go check on the arrangements for tomorrow. Big day ahead of us." He was gone before I could respond, leaving me with the distinct impression that our interaction had been an obligatory courtesy rather than genuine interest in getting to know me. Throughout the evening, similar encounters reinforced my growing sense that I was viewed as an outsider, appreciated for my financial contributions, but not valued as a person or family member. Jessica seemed oblivious to these dynamics, floating between groups with the confidence of a bride surrounded by love and support. When she hugged me goodnight, her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Tomorrow's gonna be perfect, Dad. Thank you for making all of this possible. Mom would be so proud of both of us." Driving home to Cedar Ridge that night, I pushed aside my concerns about the social dynamics I had observed. Tomorrow was Jessica's wedding day, and my role was to support her happiness, not to analyze the behavior of people who would hopefully become more welcoming over time. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that photographers dream of. I took extra care getting ready, wearing the custom suit I'd purchased specifically for the occasion, along with the silver watch Margaret had given me for our 20th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I saw a man who had worked hard his entire life, who had loved deeply and lost significantly, but who had successfully raised a daughter to be proud of. Grandview Estate looked magnificent as I arrived for the pre-ceremony preparations. The gardens were in full bloom, the historic mansion gleamed in the morning sunlight, and the wedding party was buzzing with excitement. I'd arranged to arrive early to handle any last-minute details and to spend some quiet time with Jessica before the ceremony. Mrs. Whitman, the events coordinator, greeted me warmly. "Mr. Caldwell, everything looks perfect for today. The weather is ideal, the vendors have all arrived on schedule, and your daughter is going to have the wedding of her dreams." "Thank you, Patricia. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all your work to make this day special," I replied, feeling genuine gratitude for her professionalism throughout the planning process. As I walked through the estate grounds, observing the final preparations, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The floral arrangements were stunning, the ceremony space was elegantly decorated, and every detail reflected the care and expense that had gone into creating this perfect day. This was what I had worked for my entire life, the ability to provide my daughter with memories that would last forever. Jessica was in the bridal suite with her bridesmaids, and when I knocked on the door, her maid of honor let me in with a warm smile. My daughter stood before a full-length mirror in her wedding gown,
and the sight took my breath away. She was absolutely beautiful, radiant with joy and excitement, every inch the princess she had dreamed of being since childhood. "Dad, you look so handsome," she said, turning to embrace me carefully so as not to wrinkle her dress. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready to walk my little girl down the aisle since the day you were born," I replied, feeling the familiar tightness in my throat that came with emotional moments. We spent a few minutes taking photos together, and I presented her with the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, Margaret's mother. As I fastened it around her neck, I whispered, "Your mom is here with us today, sweetheart. She would be so proud of both of us." The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, with cocktails to follow immediately afterwards. As 3:30 approached, I made my way to the designated waiting area where I would meet Jessica for our walk down the aisle. The estate's grounds were filled with guests. Nearly 200 people gathered to witness this milestone moment. From my waiting position, I could see Trevor at the altar with his groomsmen, looking nervous but happy. The string quartet I had hired was playing beautifully, creating the perfect musical backdrop for what promised to be an unforgettable ceremony. Everything I had planned and paid for was coming together exactly as Jessica had dreamed. At exactly 4 o'clock, Jessica appeared at my side, her arm linked through mine. "Ready, Dad?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement and just a touch of nervousness.
"Ready," I replied, and together we began our walk down the petal-strewn aisle toward the altar where Trevor waited to become my son-in-law. As we walked, I was acutely aware of the 200 pairs of eyes watching us, of the photographer I'd hired capturing every moment, of the perfect autumn afternoon I'd helped orchestrate. This was the culmination of months of planning and a lifetime of loving my daughter. In that moment, walking Jessica toward her future husband, I felt that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. We reached the altar, and I placed Jessica's hand in Trevor's, giving them both my blessing, with a smile that came from the depths of my heart. As I took my seat in the front row, I looked around at the perfect wedding I'd made possible and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The ceremony was beautiful, every element flowing seamlessly from one moment to the next. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and Trevor kissed my daughter for the first time as her husband, I felt tears of joy streaming down my face. This was what love looked like, what family meant, what all my years of hard work had been building toward. As the newlyweds walked back down the aisle together, followed by their wedding party, I stood with the rest of the guests to applaud and celebrate. The cocktail hour was about to begin, followed by dinner, dancing, and all the traditional elements of a perfect wedding reception. I had no idea that in less than an hour, everything I believed about my relationship with my daughter and her new husband was about to be shattered, and that the perfect wedding I'd created would become the stage for the most humiliating experience of my life. The cocktail hour following the ceremony was everything I had envisioned when Jessica and I first toured Grandview Estate. Golden sunlight filtered through the ancient oak trees, casting warm shadows across the manicured lawns where guests mingled with champagne flutes and elegant hors d'oeuvres. The string quartet continued their performance from a gazebo overlooking the valley, their music creating the perfect soundtrack for what should have been pure celebration. I found myself gravitating toward the bar area, not out of any particular desire for alcohol, but because it offered a vantage point from which I could observe the festivities and feel connected to the joy surrounding Jessica's special day. The bartender, a young man with a professional demeanor, smiled as he prepared drinks with practiced efficiency. "Beautiful wedding, sir," he commented as he mixed a whiskey sour for another guest. "The bride looks absolutely radiant." "She does indeed," I replied, pride evident in my voice. "She's my daughter." "Congratulations, then. You must be very proud. This is quite an elegant affair." His words reinforced the satisfaction I felt, watching the seamless execution of every detail Jessica and I had planned.
The photographer moved discreetly among the guests, capturing candid moments that would become treasured memories. The floral arrangements, positioned strategically throughout the grounds, provided stunning backdrops for the countless photos being taken by family and friends. As I sipped my drink, I noticed Trevor's college friends gathered near the fountain, their animated conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter. They were a tight-knit group, most of them having known each other since their undergraduate days at Virginia Tech. During the engagement period, Jessica had mentioned how important it was to Trevor that his friends approve of her, and from what I could observe, she had clearly won them over. One of Trevor's groomsmen, a tall man named Bradley, whom I'd met briefly at the rehearsal dinner, approached the bar while I was standing there. He ordered a bourbon neat and nodded politely in my direction. "Great party, Mr. Caldwell. Jessica and Trevor seem really happy." "They do indeed. It's been wonderful seeing everything come together so perfectly," I responded, hoping to engage in friendly conversation with someone from the groom's side of the family. Bradley took a sip of his bourbon and glanced around the estate grounds. "This place must have cost a fortune. Trevor mentioned that Jessica's family was handling the venue costs. Pretty generous of you folks." There was something in his tone that made me slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't immediately identify what bothered me about his comment. Perhaps it was the way he emphasized generous, or the casual assumption that Jessica's family meant something other than just me at such a large gathering. But I dismissed my concerns, attributing them to my own sensitivity about being the sole representative of the bride's family at such a large gathering. "We wanted Jessica to have the wedding she dreamed of," I replied simply, not feeling the need to elaborate on the financial specifics with someone I barely knew. Bradley nodded and drifted away toward his friends, leaving me alone at the bar again. As the cocktail hour continued, I found myself in several similar conversations with various guests, most of whom seemed genuinely appreciative of the elegant celebration, while remaining somewhat distant in their interactions with me. Jessica appeared at my side as the sun began to set, her wedding gown rustling softly as she moved. The golden light caught the pearl necklace I'd given her, making it shimmer against her skin. "Dad, having the best time," she said, linking her arm through mine. "Everything is absolutely perfect. The photographer is getting amazing shots, and everyone keeps telling me how beautiful everything looks." "I'm so glad, sweetheart. You look absolutely stunning, and seeing you this happy makes every moment worthwhile." We stood together watching the guests mingle throughout the estate grounds, and for a moment I felt the deep contentment that comes from seeing a major life goal achieved. This was what I had worked toward for decades, the ability to provide my daughter with a perfect beginning to her married life. "Trevor's friends are really impressed with the venue," Jessica continued. "Bradley was just telling me how amazed they all are by the whole production. He said it's the most elegant wedding he's ever attended." I remembered my brief conversation with Bradley at the bar and wondered if Jessica had heard the same subtle undertones in his comments that had made me uncomfortable. But her obvious happiness pushed aside any lingering concerns I might have had about the social dynamics I'd been observing. Mrs. Whitman appeared beside us, clipboard in hand and wearing the focused expression of someone managing a complex event. "Mr. Caldwell, Jessica, we're ready to transition into the reception space. The dining room looks absolutely magnificent, and your guests are going to be so impressed with the setup." The reception hall at Grandview Estate was indeed spectacular. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables dressed in ivory linens and adorned with elaborate centerpieces of roses and peonies. Each place setting featured fine china and silver cutlery that gleamed under the soft lighting. The head table, positioned on a slightly elevated platform, overlooked the entire room and provided the perfect vantage point for the bride and groom to see all their guests. As the guests filed into the reception space, I took my assigned seat at the head table, positioned to Jessica's left, while Trevor sat to her right. The seating arrangement had been carefully planned to honor both families, though I couldn't help but notice that Trevor's side of the table was populated with his parents, siblings, and closest friends, while my section included Jessica's bridesmaids and Helen, my sister-in-law, who had driven up from Richmond for the ceremony. The dinner service began with a champagne toast led by Trevor's father, Robert Harrison. He stood with practiced confidence, clearly comfortable addressing large groups, and raised his glass toward the newlyweds. "To Trevor and Jessica," he began, his voice carrying easily through the reception hall. "We have watched these two young people find each other and build something beautiful together."
Trevor, you've chosen wisely. And Jessica, welcome to the Harrison family. We're thrilled to have you as our daughter-in-law. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and I joined enthusiastically, while noting that Robert's toast, while heartfelt, focused entirely on welcoming Jessica into his family without acknowledging my role or presence in her life. Perhaps that was simply the traditional approach for the groom's father, but it reinforced the feeling I'd been having throughout the day that I was somehow peripheral to the main celebration. The meal itself was exceptional, featuring the menu Jessica and I had carefully selected during our tasting session with the estate's catering team. Each course was beautifully presented and perfectly prepared, earning compliments from guests at every table. The service staff moved efficiently throughout the room, ensuring that wine glasses remained filled and that every dietary restriction was accommodated. As the evening progressed, I found myself increasingly aware of the conversations happening around me at the head table. Trevor's friends were regaling each other with stories from their college days, their shared experiences creating an easy camaraderie that naturally excluded those of us who hadn't been part of their group. Jessica participated in these conversations with obvious enjoyment, laughing at inside jokes and adding her own memories from the time she'd spent with Trevor during their dating years. Helen, seated next to me, leaned over during a lull in the conversation. "Marcus, this is absolutely beautiful," she whispered. "Margaret would have been so proud to see Jessica so happy. You've really outdone yourself with this celebration." Her words meant more to me than she could have known. Helen had been Margaret's closest confidant, and her approval carried the weight of her sister's blessing. But even as I appreciated her recognition, I couldn't shake the growing sense that I was being viewed as a checkbook rather than a father by many of the people around me. The evening's formal program began with speeches from the wedding party. Trevor's best man, a software engineer named David, who had been his roommate in college, delivered a humorous and heartfelt tribute that had the entire room laughing and wiping away tears. Jessica's maid of honor followed with her own speech, sharing memories of their friendship and expressing her joy at seeing Jessica find her perfect match. As the speeches concluded, Mrs. Whitman approached the head table to confirm the schedule for the remaining events. The father-daughter dance was planned for 9 o'clock, followed by the traditional dances and open dancing for all guests. I had been looking forward to this moment since Jessica was a little girl, imagining the day when I would dance with her at her wedding while everyone watched and celebrated our special bond. "Mr. Caldwell, we're ready for your speech whenever you'd like to present it," Mrs. Whitman said quietly. "The microphone is all set up and the guests are expecting to hear from the father of the bride." I had spent considerable time preparing my remarks, wanting to honor Margaret's memory while celebrating Jessica's future and welcoming Trevor into our family. As I stood and moved toward the microphone, I felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and pride that came with important public moments. The reception hall gradually quieted as guests realized that another speech was about to begin. I looked out over the sea of faces, most of them strangers to me, but all gathered to celebrate my daughter's happiness. Jessica smiled encouragingly from her seat at the head table, and Trevor nodded politely in my direction. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marcus Caldwell, Jessica's father." A polite round of applause greeted this introduction, and I continued with the opening remarks I'd rehearsed. 28 years ago, Margaret and I welcomed Jessica into our world, and from that moment, our lives were transformed by this incredible little person who brought joy and purpose to everything we did. Margaret, my beloved wife, passed away 11 years ago, but I know she's here with us tonight, beaming with pride at the beautiful woman Jessica has become. I paused, noting the respectful silence in the room and the emotional expressions on several faces, including Jessica, who was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Jessica, watching you grow up has been the greatest privilege of my life. You've inherited your mother's grace, her compassion, and her strength, while adding your own unique spirit that has made you the remarkable woman you are today. And Trevor, welcome to our family. I can see how much you love my daughter, and I'm grateful that she's found someone who appreciates the treasure she is. The speech continued for several more minutes, touching on memories of Jessica's childhood, my hopes for their marriage, and my commitment to supporting their future together. As I concluded and raised my glass for a final toast to the newlyweds, the applause was warm and sustained, and I felt satisfied that I'd struck the right balance between emotion and celebration. Returning to my seat, Jessica reached over and squeezed my hand. "That was beautiful, Dad. Mom would have loved every word." The remainder of dinner passed pleasantly, with guests moving between tables to visit with friends and family they hadn't seen in some time. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, exactly what I had hoped to create for Jessica's special day. As 9 o'clock approached, the DJ began setting up for the dancing portion of the evening. The father-daughter dance was scheduled to open the dance floor, followed by the mother-son dance between Trevor and his mother, then the first dance for the newlyweds as husband and wife. I had chosen Butterfly Kisses by Bob Carlyle for our dance, a song that had always reminded me of Jessica and the special relationship we'd shared throughout her childhood. As the opening notes began to play, I stood and extended my hand to my daughter, who rose gracefully from her chair and moved toward the center of the dance floor with me. Dancing with Jessica at her wedding was everything I had imagined it would be and more. She was radiant in her wedding gown, moving with the confidence and grace that had characterized her throughout her life. As we swayed to the music, I was transported back to countless moments from her childhood, from the first time she'd stood on my feet as a toddler pretending to dance, to the father-daughter dances at her school events, to this perfect culmination of our relationship. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. "Thank you for making this day so perfect." "I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know." As the song concluded, the room erupted in applause, and Trevor joined us on the dance floor for his dance with his mother, while Jessica and I returned to our table. The first dance for the newlyweds followed, and soon the dance floor was filled with guests celebrating and enjoying the music. The evening was proceeding exactly as planned, with every element flowing seamlessly into the next. Guests were dancing, mingling, and clearly enjoying themselves. The bar service was excellent, the music was perfect for the diverse age groups represented among the attendees, and the overall atmosphere was one of pure celebration. Around 10 o'clock, I stepped outside onto one of the estate's terraces to get some fresh air and take a moment to appreciate the success of the evening. The autumn night was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. From the terrace, I could see into the reception hall through the large windows, watching the continuing celebration and feeling deep satisfaction with everything we had accomplished. I was joined on the terrace by several other guests who had also stepped outside for air, including some of Trevor's extended family members whom I hadn't yet had the opportunity to meet. The conversation was casual and pleasant, focused on what a beautiful wedding it had been and how happy Jessica and Trevor appeared together. "Marcus, right?" said a woman I recognized as Trevor's aunt from the dinner seating chart. "I'm Linda Harrison, Robert's sister. Wonderful wedding." "Thank you, Linda."
It's been such a joy to see everything come together so perfectly. "You've certainly spared no expense," she continued, her tone casual, but her words carrying an undertone I couldn't quite decipher. "This venue alone must have cost a fortune, not to mention all the other details. Jessica's very fortunate to have such a generous father." Again, I found myself slightly uncomfortable with the way the conversation seemed to focus on the financial aspects of the wedding rather than the emotional significance of the day. But I reminded myself that people often expressed appreciation for celebrations by acknowledging the resources that made them possible. "Jessica deserves the best," I replied simply. "This is her day, and I wanted it to be everything she dreamed of." Linda nodded and continued chatting about various aspects of the wedding. But her comments reinforced the pattern I'd been noticing throughout the day. Many people seem to view the wedding primarily through the lens of its cost rather than its meaning, and my role appeared to be defined more by my financial contribution than by my relationship with the bride. Re-entering the reception hall, I noticed that the evening was reaching its natural peak. The dance floor was crowded with guests of all ages. The bar area was busy, but not overwhelmed, and the overall energy level suggested that everyone was having a genuinely good time. Mrs. Whitman caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up, indicating that everything was proceeding according to schedule. I returned to the head table, where Jessica and Trevor were taking a brief break from dancing. They both looked flushed and happy, clearly enjoying their celebration and the attention of their friends and family. "Dad, this is seriously the best night of my life," Jessica said, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Everything is so perfect. The food, the music, the dancing, everything." "I'm so glad, sweetheart. Seeing you this happy makes it all worthwhile." Trevor nodded in agreement, though I noticed he was checking his phone even during this moment of celebration. When he looked up, he addressed me directly for one of the first times all evening. "Mr. Caldwell, this is really an incredible party. Jessica's friends from work have been talking about how impressed they are with everything." His comment struck me as somewhat impersonal, focusing on the impressions of other people rather than expressing his own gratitude or appreciation. But I attributed this to his youth and perhaps nervousness about addressing his new father-in-law in such a formal setting. As 11 o'clock approached, I began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere that suggested the evening was beginning to wind down. Some of the older guests were starting to make their departures, stopping by the head table to offer their congratulations and thanks before heading home. The dance floor remained active, but the energy was becoming more relaxed and intimate. I was standing near the gift table, observing the impressive collection of wrapped presents that guests had brought to celebrate the newlyweds, when I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. Trevor was standing with his college friends near the bar area, their voices slightly elevated from the alcohol and excitement of the evening. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but their proximity and the acoustics of the room made their conversation audible from where I was standing. "Dude, this whole thing is insane," one of them was saying. "The venue, the food, the open bar, everything. This must have cost like 60 grand easy." "More than that," Trevor replied, and I could hear the slight slur in his voice that indicated he'd been drinking steadily throughout the evening. "Jessica's old man went completely overboard. 45 just for the venue, plus all the other stuff. Damn, man. That's more than I make in a year," another voice chimed in. "Your father-in-law must be loaded." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized they were discussing my financial contribution to the wedding, as if it were some kind of entertainment or curiosity, rather than a gift of love to my daughter. "The best part is, he's been throwing money around for months," Trevor continued, his voice carrying a tone that I found disturbing. "The bachelor party, Jessica's dress, the honeymoon, everything. The guy just writes checks for whatever we ask for." "That's awesome, man. Must be nice having a sugar daddy father-in-law," one of his friends said, followed by laughter that made my stomach turn. I stood frozen, unable to move away from what I was hearing, but horrified by the casual cruelty of their conversation. These were the people my daughter had married into, and they were discussing my generosity as if it were some kind of entertainment or curiosity, rather than a gift of love to my daughter. "Just wait until he finds out about the house," Trevor said, his voice dropping slightly but still audible to me. "Jessica's working on him to help with the down payment. She thinks she can get at least 100 grand out of him." The words hit me like a physical blow. A house down payment that Jessica hadn't mentioned to me? Discussed as if it were already a foregone conclusion that I would provide it? And the casual way Trevor referred to getting money out of me suggested that my role in their lives was purely transactional. "You guys are so lucky. My parents made me pay for my own wedding, and Sarah's family didn't contribute anything either. We're still paying off the credit cards 3 years later." "Yeah, well, Jessica knows how to work her dad. She's got him wrapped around her finger. All she has to do is mention her dead mom, and he gets all emotional and starts writing checks." The reference to Margaret, to Jessica using her mother's memory to manipulate me financially,
was like a knife to my heart. I felt physically sick as I realized that what I had interpreted as my daughter honoring her mother's memory was actually a calculated strategy to extract money from me. I forced myself to move away from the conversation, walking toward the restroom area where I could be alone and try to process what I had just learned. My hands were shaking as I pushed through the door, and I had to grip the sink to steady myself as the full implications of what I heard began to sink in. Everything I had believed about my relationship with Jessica, about the love and appreciation I thought she felt for my support, had been revealed as something entirely different. To her and Trevor, I wasn't a father and father-in-law worthy of respect and gratitude. I was a resource to be exploited, an easy target for financial manipulation. The wedding that I had paid for, the celebration I had made possible out of love for my daughter, was being discussed by her new husband as if it were some kind of scam they had pulled off successfully. And they were already planning their next request, confident that I would continue to provide whatever they asked for. Standing in that restroom, looking at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a man who had been played for a fool by the people he loved most. The elegant suit I'd worn to walk my daughter down the aisle, the proud smile I'd worn throughout the evening, the satisfaction I'd felt at providing Jessica with her perfect wedding, all of it felt hollow and meaningless in light of what I had discovered. I stayed in the restroom for a few minutes, trying to compose myself and decide what to do with this devastating knowledge. Part of me wanted to confront Trevor and his friends immediately, to let them know that I had heard their cruel conversation.
Another part of me wanted to find Jessica and demand an explanation for the manipulation and deception that had apparently been going on for months. But as I considered my options, I realized that confronting anyone at the wedding would only create a scene that would ruin Jessica's special day and embarrass everyone involved. Whatever I decided to do about this situation would have to wait until after the celebration was over. When I finally emerged from the restroom, I found Jessica looking for me near the head table. "Dad, there you are. I was wondering where you'd gone," she said, her face bright with the joy of her wedding celebration. Looking at her in that moment, seeing the happiness in her eyes and the beautiful wedding gown that I had paid for, I felt a complex mixture of love and betrayal that I couldn't begin to untangle. This was still my daughter, the child I had raised and loved unconditionally. But she was also someone who had apparently been deceiving me for months about her motivations and intentions. "Just needed a moment to myself," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been quite an evening." "It really has been perfect, hasn't it?" she said, taking my arm. "Come dance with me one more time before the night ends." As we returned to the dance floor for another father-daughter dance, I tried to push aside what I had learned and focus on the moment with Jessica. But the knowledge of what Trevor and his friends had said, and the implications for what my daughter truly thought of me, cast a shadow over what should have been one of the most treasured memories of my life. The remainder of the evening passed in a haze of forced smiles and automatic responses to well-wishers and departing guests. I went through the motions of being the proud father of the bride, accepting congratulations and thanks for the beautiful celebration, all while feeling as if I were watching everything from outside my own body. By midnight, the last guests were departing and the cleanup crew was beginning to break down the reception setup. Jessica and Trevor were saying their final goodbyes before leaving for their hotel, where they would spend their wedding night before departing for their Italian honeymoon the next afternoon. "Dad, I can't thank you enough for making this day so incredible," Jessica said as she hugged me goodbye. "It was everything I dreamed it would be and more." "I'm glad you're happy, sweetheart," I managed to reply, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else. "We'll call you from Italy," she promised, "and when we get back, we'll have you over for dinner so we can look at all the photos together." As I watched them leave, Trevor's arm around my daughter's waist, I wondered if that dinner invitation would include a discussion of the house down payment that Trevor had mentioned to his friends. Would Jessica approach that conversation the same way she had apparently approached all her other financial requests, with calculated manipulation designed to exploit my love for her and my grief over Margaret's death? The drive home to Cedar Ridge was the longest 45 minutes of my life. The mountain roads that I had traveled thousands of times seemed foreign and threatening in the darkness, and I found myself having to pull over twice to collect myself as waves of emotion threatened to overwhelm me. By the time I reached my house, the adrenaline that had carried me through the evening was wearing off, leaving me exhausted and heartsick. I sat in my driveway for several minutes, looking at the home that Margaret and I had shared, the place where we had raised Jessica and built the life that I thought had prepared me to be a loving and supportive father. Inside the house, I poured myself a drink and sat in my favorite chair, still wearing my wedding suit, trying to make sense of what had happened. The evening had begun with such promise, such joy and celebration, and it ended with the revelation that my relationship with my daughter was built on lies and manipulation. As I sat there in the quiet of my home, I began to think about all the financial requests Jessica had made over the years since Margaret's death, and I started to see them in a new light. The car repairs that always seemed to happen right when I was feeling particularly lonely, the medical expenses that coincided with anniversaries of Margaret's death, the career opportunities that required financial support just when I was most vulnerable to appeals about Jessica's future. Had all of it been calculated? Had Jessica been systematically exploiting my grief and my desire to provide for her happiness? The thought was almost too painful to consider, but the evidence seemed overwhelming in light of what I had overheard at the wedding. I thought about the conversation Trevor had with his friends, the casual cruelty with which they had discussed my generosity, and the planning that was already underway for the next financial request. $100,000 for a house down payment, treated as if it were already guaranteed rather than something they would need to ask for and justify. Most painfully, I thought about Trevor's comment about Jessica using Margaret's memory to manipulate me emotionally. Every time my daughter had mentioned her mother in connection with a financial request, every time she had talked about what Margaret would have wanted for her future had been part of a deliberate strategy to exploit my love and grief. The wedding that I had just paid for, the perfect celebration that had cost me over $65,000, had been the stage for the revelation that my daughter and her new husband viewed me not as a beloved family member, but as a financial resource to be manipulated and exploited. As dawn began to break over the Virginia mountains, I was still sitting in that chair, still wearing my wedding suit, trying to decide what to do with the knowledge that would forever change my relationship with the daughter I had loved and supported unconditionally for 28 years. The perfect wedding I had created for Jessica had become the backdrop for the most devastating betrayal of my life. And as I sat there in the growing morning light, I began to realize that the generous, trusting father who had walked his daughter down the aisle the previous afternoon was gone forever, replaced by a man who finally understood the true nature of the relationship he had been funding for years. The morning after the wedding arrived with an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the windows of my house in Cedar Ridge. I had finally fallen asleep around 5 in the morning, still fully dressed in my wedding suit, and woke up 3 hours later feeling as though I had aged a decade overnight. The autumn sunlight that had seemed so promising the day before now felt harsh and unwelcome as it streamed through the curtains of my living room. My first instinct was to call Jessica, to confront her about what I had overheard at the reception, to demand an explanation for the betrayal that had shattered my understanding of our relationship. But as I reached for the phone, I realized that she and Trevor were probably still asleep after their wedding night, and more importantly, that I needed time to think through my response carefully rather than reacting out of raw emotion. Instead, I made coffee with hands that still trembled slightly from the shock of the previous evening's revelations. As I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the mountains that had been my backdrop for over 2 decades, I began to replay every interaction I had had with Jessica and Trevor over the past year, searching for signs that I had missed or misinterpreted. The pattern, once I began to looking for it, was unmistakable. Every major financial request had been accompanied by emotional manipulation, designed to make refusal seem heartless or selfish. references to Margaret's wishes for Jessica's future, mentions of how proud her mother would have been to see Jessica succeed, appeals to my role as the only parent she had left and my responsibility to ensure her happiness. I thought about the phone call asking for help with the venue deposit, how Jessica had mentioned that Trevor's family was contributing to other aspects of the wedding, creating the impression that I was participating in a joint effort rather than funding the entire celebration myself. Now I understood that this had been deliberately misleading, designed to make my contribution seem reasonable rather than excessive. The bachelor party funding request took on a new and more sinister meaning when viewed through this lens. Jessica's tears about Trevor being embarrassed in front of his friends, her insistence that his happiness was crucial to their upcoming marriage, had all been calculated to manipulate my emotions and override my practical objections to spending $5,000 on a weekend in Las Vegas. Most painfully, I began to see how Margaret's memory had been weaponized against me. Every time Jessica had said something like, "Mom would have wanted me to have the best," or "I know Mom is watching and would be so proud," had been part of a deliberate strategy to exploit my love and grief. The wedding that I had just paid for, the perfect celebration that had cost me over $65,000, had been the stage for the revelation that my daughter and her new husband viewed me not as a beloved family member, but as a financial resource to be manipulated and exploited. As dawn began to break over the Virginia mountains, I was still sitting in that chair, still wearing my wedding suit, trying to decide what to do with the knowledge that would forever change my relationship with the daughter I had loved and supported unconditionally for 28 years. The perfect wedding I had created for Jessica had become the backdrop for the most devastating betrayal of my life. And as I sat there in the growing morning light, I began to realize that the generous, trusting father who had walked his daughter down the aisle the previous afternoon was gone forever, replaced by a man who finally understood the true nature of the relationship he had been funding for years. The morning after the wedding arrived with an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the windows of my house in Cedar Ridge. I had finally fallen asleep around 5 in the morning, still fully dressed in my wedding suit, and woke up 3 hours later feeling as though I had aged a decade overnight. The autumn sunlight that had seemed so promising the day before now felt harsh and unwelcome as it streamed through the curtains of my living room. My first instinct was to call, "I hope you're getting some rest after yesterday. What a beautiful celebration that was." Jessica looked absolutely radiant, and everything was so elegantly done. "Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it," I replied, the words feeling hollow given what I now knew about the true nature of the event. "I wanted to call and tell you how impressed everyone was with the whole affair. The venue was spectacular, and the attention to detail was remarkable. You really went above and beyond to make Jessica's day perfect." Helen's praise, which would have filled me with satisfaction the day before, now felt like salt in an open wound. She was complimenting me for being successfully manipulated, for falling victim to my daughter's calculated deception. "I'm glad people enjoyed themselves," I said, not trusting myself to say more without revealing the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. "There was one thing, though," Helen continued, her tone shifting slightly. "I couldn't help but notice some of the conversations I overheard from Trevor's friends. They seemed very focused on the financial aspects of the wedding rather than the celebration itself. I hope that doesn't bother you, but I found their attitudes somewhat concerning." My heart rate increased as I realized that Helen might have witnessed some of the same disturbing behavior I had observed. "What kind of conversations?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Well, there was a lot of discussion about how much everything must have cost, and some comments about Jessica being lucky to have such a generous father. Nothing inappropriate, exactly, but it struck me as a bit tactless for a wedding celebration. These are supposed to be joyful occasions, not opportunities to speculate about other people's finances." Helen's observations confirmed that my discomfort with the social dynamics of the wedding had been justified. If she had noticed the inappropriate focus on money from her position as a guest, then my perceptions as the person funding the celebration had been accurate rather than oversensitive.
I noticed some of that as well, I admitted. It was uncomfortable at times. I'm sure it was. Margaret always said that money brings out people's true character, both good and bad. She would have been appalled by some of the attitudes I observed yesterday. The mention of Margaret in this context hit me particularly hard given what I had learned about how Jessica had been using her mother's memory as a tool for manipulation. Helen's comment reminded me that Margaret had indeed been wise about financial matters and human nature, and that she probably would have seen through Jessica's deceptions long before I did. After ending the call with Helen, I spent the remainder of the afternoon researching my options for addressing the situation. The wedding was over, the money had been spent, and there was no practical way to undo the financial damage that had already been done. But Trevor's comments about the planned request for house down payment money suggested that the manipulation was ongoing and would continue unless I took decisive action to stop it. I considered several approaches. I could confront Jessica directly about what I had overheard, demanding an explanation and an apology. I could have a private conversation with Trevor, letting him know that I was aware of his true feelings about me and his plans for future financial exploitation. I could simply refuse any future requests for money without explanation, forcing them to guess whether I knew about their deceptions. But as I thought through these options, I realized that they all assumed that Jessica and Trevor were capable of genuine remorse and behavioral change. The casual cruelty with which Trevor had discussed my generosity and the calculating nature of Jessica's emotional manipulation suggested that they viewed me as a resource rather than a person deserving of respect and honesty. By evening, I had reached a decision that would have seemed impossible to me 24 hours earlier. If Jessica and Trevor wanted to treat our relationship as a purely transactional arrangement, if they saw me only as a source of funding for their lifestyle and ambitions, then I would respond by terminating the transaction. I called Mrs. Whitman at Grandview Estate, knowing that she would still be dealing with post-wedding cleanup and final billing matters. "Mrs. Whitman, this is Marcus Caldwell. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time?" "Not at all, Mr. Caldwell. I was actually planning to call you tomorrow to follow up on yesterday's event. Everything went smoothly from our perspective, and I hope you were satisfied with how the celebration turned out." "That's actually why I'm calling," I said, taking a brief deep breath before continuing. "I need to discuss the payment arrangements we had in place. Of course, is there a problem with the final billing? I have all the documentation here if you need to review any specific charges. Actually, there's been a change in circumstances that affects who should be responsible for the payment. I need to reverse the charges I've made and transfer the financial responsibility to the bride and groom themselves." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear Mrs. Whitman shuffling through papers. "I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Caldwell. You've already paid the full amount for the venue and associated services. The transaction was completed several weeks ago." "Yes, I understand that, but I'm requesting that you refund my payment and send the bill directly to Jessica and Trevor. I'll provide their contact information and current address." "Mr. Caldwell, this is quite unusual. May I ask what prompted this change? We typically don't reverse completed transactions after events have taken place, especially not successful celebrations like yesterday's wedding." I had anticipated this question and had prepared my response carefully. "Let's just say that I've learned some information that changes my willingness to be financially responsible for the celebration. I'm sure you can understand that family dynamics are complicated." Mrs. Whitman's voice became more cautious. "I see.
Well, this would require approval from our management, and we'd need to ensure that the bride and groom are able to take responsibility for the charges before we could process any refund to you." "That's fine. Please contact them directly and let them know that the payment arrangements have changed. I'm confident they'll be able to handle the financial obligations." As I provided Jessica and Trevor's contact information, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because I was finally taking control of a situation where I had been exploited and manipulated. Sadness because this action would inevitably destroy whatever remained of my relationship with my daughter. The next morning brought the phone call I had been expecting. Jessica's name appeared on my caller ID at 8:30, much earlier than she typically called on a Sunday. I let it ring 4 times before answering, wanting to compose myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" Jessica's voice was shrill with panic and anger. "I just got a call from the wedding venue saying that you reversed the payment and that Trevor and I are now responsible for $45,000. They're threatening to send us to collections if we don't pay within 30 days. "Good morning, Jessica. I trust you had a nice wedding night," I replied calmly, refusing to match her emotional intensity. "Don't give me that. What are you doing? Why would you do this to us? We don't have $45,000 just lying around. We used all our savings for the honeymoon and the deposits on our apartment." "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said. Perhaps Trevor's family, who I was told were contributing to the wedding expenses, could help with this unexpected financial burden. There was a moment of silence, and I could hear Trevor's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out his words. "Dad, I don't understand why you're doing this. The wedding was beautiful, everyone had a wonderful time, and now you're trying to ruin everything by creating this financial crisis for us." "Jessica, I think we need to have an honest conversation about a lot of things. Why don't you and Trevor come over this afternoon? We can discuss the situation in person." "We can't come over. We're supposed to leave for our honeymoon in 3 hours. Our flight to Italy is this afternoon." "Well then, perhaps the conversation will have to wait until you return. In the meantime, I suggest you contact your wedding venue and work out a payment plan that fits your budget." "Our budget?" Jessica's voice cracked with disbelief. "Dad, you know we can't afford this. That's why we asked for your help in the first place. You can't just change your mind after the fact and leave us with this debt." "Actually, Jessica, I can. It's my money, and I've decided to allocate it differently. Consider it a wedding gift to help you and Trevor learn about financial responsibility and the real cost of the lifestyle you want to maintain." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute before Jessica spoke again, her voice now cold and calculated. "Fine. If that's how you want to play this, we'll figure it out ourselves. But don't expect us to come running back to you when we get home from Italy. And don't expect to be involved in our lives going forward if this is how you're going to treat us." "Jessica, if you'd like to have an adult conversation about why I made this decision, I'm available when you return from your honeymoon. But until then, I suggest you focus on enjoying your trip and thinking about how you want to approach our relationship going forward." She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me holding the phone in the silence of my kitchen. Part of me wanted to call her back, to apologize and reverse my decision, to restore the harmony that had characterized our relationship for so many years. But I reminded myself of what I had overheard at the wedding reception, of the casual cruelty with which Trevor and his friends had discussed my generosity, and of the calculated manipulation Jessica had been employing for months. The following week passed quietly, with no further communication from Jessica or Trevor. I assumed they had found a way to resolve the immediate crisis with the wedding venue, either through family assistance or emergency credit arrangements. Their silence suggested that they were either too angry to contact me or too busy dealing with the financial implications of their situation. I used this quiet period to make additional changes to my financial arrangements. I contacted my bank and removed Jessica as a beneficiary from several accounts where she had been listed. I made an appointment with my attorney to revise my will, reducing Jessica's inheritance significantly and adding charitable organizations as primary beneficiaries. I also established new investment accounts that would be entirely under my control without any family members having knowledge of their existence. These actions felt both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because I was finally asserting control over my own financial resources and refusing to be manipulated any longer. Heartbreaking because each change represented another step away from the daughter I had loved and supported unconditionally for 28 years. Helen called several times during this period. Sensing that something had changed in my mood and demeanor, I deflected her concerns without revealing the details of what had happened, simply saying that I was reevaluating some aspects of my relationship with Jessica and Trevor. She seemed to understand that I needed space to work through whatever was troubling me.
The confrontation I had been expecting finally came 3 weeks later when Jessica and Trevor returned from their honeymoon. They arrived at my house unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, both of them looking tanned and rested from their Italian vacation, but wearing expressions of determined anger. I watched from my front window as they got out of Trevor's car and walked toward my front door, noting the new designer luggage they were carrying and the expensive-looking clothes they were wearing. Apparently, the financial crisis I had created hadn't prevented them from enjoying their honeymoon in style. The doorbell rang with unusual persistence, suggesting that they were prepared to wait as long as necessary for me to answer. I took my time walking to the door, using the moments to prepare myself for what I knew would be an unpleasant confrontation. "Hello, Jessica, Trevor," I said as I opened the door, making no move to invite them inside. "We need to talk," Jessica said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This situation has gone on long enough."
"I agree. Please, come in." They entered my living room with the wary posture of people entering hostile territory. Jessica sat on the edge of the sofa, where she had spent countless hours during her childhood, while Trevor remained standing, his arms crossed defensively across his chest. "Dad, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this behavior has to stop," Jessica began without preamble. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through? We had to borrow money from Trevor's parents to pay the wedding venue, and now we're starting our marriage with a huge debt that we never planned for." "I see. And how did Trevor's parents react when they learned about the true cost of the wedding they thought they were sharing responsibility for?" Trevor shifted uncomfortably at my question, and Jessica's eyes flashed with what might have been guilt or embarrassment. "That's not the point," she said quickly. "The point is that you made a commitment to pay for our wedding, and then you pulled the rug out from under us after the fact. It's not fair and it's not right." "Jessica, let me ask you something. When you were planning this wedding, when you were asking for my financial support, did you see it as a gift from a father to his daughter, or did you see it as something you were entitled to receive?" "What kind of question is that? Of course it was a gift. But when someone gives you a gift, they don't take it back later because they're having some kind of emotional crisis." I looked at Trevor, who had remained silent during this exchange, but whose body language suggested he was preparing for battle. "Trevor, would you like to contribute to this conversation? After all, this situation affects you as much as it affects Jessica." "Look, Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone I had heard at the wedding reception. "I don't know what your problem is, but Jessica is right. You can't just change the terms of an agreement after everyone has already lived up to their end of the bargain. We had the wedding you paid for, and now you want the money back? That's not how things work in the real world." "The real world," I repeated. "That's interesting terminology. Tell me, Trevor, in your understanding of the real world, is it acceptable for a son-in-law to refer to his wife's father as a sugar daddy who can be manipulated into providing whatever financial support they need?" The color drained from Trevor's face, and Jessica looked confused by the sudden shift in the conversation. "What are you talking about?" Jessica asked, looking back and forth between Trevor and me. "I'm talking about the conversation your husband had with his friends at your wedding reception, where he discussed how easy it was to get money out of me and how you were already working on getting $100,000 from me for a house down payment." Jessica's mouth fell open, and Trevor took a step backward as if he had been physically struck. "I'm talking about Trevor's friends laughing about having a sugar daddy father-in-law and discussing my financial contributions to your wedding as if they were some kind of successful scam you had pulled off." "Dad, that's not—" Jessica started to say, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Most importantly, Jessica, I'm talking about Trevor's comment that you know how to work me by mentioning your mother, and that all you have to do is reference her memory and I get emotional and start writing checks."
The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Jessica looked at Trevor with an expression of horror and disbelief, while Trevor's face had turned red with embarrassment and anger. "You were eavesdropping on a private conversation?" Trevor finally said, his voice defensive. "I was standing at my own daughter's wedding reception when you and your friends decided to have a loud, drunken conversation about how easily you could manipulate me financially. I didn't have to eavesdrop. You were broadcasting your contempt for me to anyone within earshot." Jessica stood up from the sofa, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Trevor, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't say those things about my father and my mother." Trevor's silence was answer enough. Jessica sank back onto the sofa, covering her face with her hands. "Jessica, I want you to think carefully about every financial request you've made over the past year. I want you to consider whether you've been honest with me about your motivations or whether you've been using your mother's memory and my grief as tools to get what you wanted." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, but I could see the calculation behind the emotion, the same manipulation I had fallen for so many times before. "Dad, I never meant for you to hear those things. Trevor was drunk and his friends were being stupid. It doesn't mean anything." "It means everything, Jessica. It means that the relationship I thought we had, the love and respect I believed you felt for me, has been a lie designed to keep the money flowing. It means that your mother's memory has been nothing more than a weapon you've used against me whenever you wanted something." Trevor finally found his voice again. "Look, maybe I said some things I shouldn't have said, but the bottom line is that we're family now, and family helps each other out. You've got more money than you know what to do with, and we're just starting out. It's not unreasonable for you to help us get established." "Help you get established," I repeated. "Is that what you call $70,000 in wedding expenses, plus whatever future amounts you had planned to extract from me?" "$70,000?" Jessica gasped. "The wedding cost $70,000? The wedding you thought I was partially funding while Trevor's family handled other expenses cost me $70,000. Every vendor, every service, every detail of your perfect day came out of my pocket while you told me that other people were contributing to ensure it didn't seem like I was being taken advantage of." The weight of these revelations seemed to settle over Jessica like a physical burden. She slumped forward on the sofa, no longer maintaining eye contact with me. "I never asked you for $70,000, she said quietly. "No, you asked for it piece by piece, request by request, each one accompanied by emotional manipulation designed to make refusal seem heartless. The venue deposit because you'd found the perfect place and Trevor's family was contributing too. The photographer because it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The dress alterations because you wanted to look perfect for your wedding photos.
The bachelor party because Trevor would be embarrassed in front of his friends. Each request seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they represented a systematic campaign to extract as much money from me as possible. Trevor's defensive posture had gradually shifted to defeat as the full scope of their deception became clear. "We didn't plan it that way," he said weakly. "It just kind of happened." "It happened because you saw me as a resource rather than a person," I replied. "Because you both believed that my love for Jessica and my grief over Margaret made me an easy target for financial manipulation." Jessica finally looked up at me, her makeup smeared with tears. "What do you want from us, Dad? Do you want us to pay back every penny? Do you want us to apologize and promise never to ask for anything again? What will it take to fix this?" Her question revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what had been broken between us. She was still thinking in terms of negotiation and transaction rather than recognizing the deeper betrayal of trust that had occurred. "Jessica, what I want is for you to understand that you've destroyed our relationship by treating me like a bank account instead of your father. What I want is for you to recognize that using your mother's memory to manipulate me was cruel and unforgivable. What I want is for you to acknowledge that the love and respect I thought we shared has been a lie designed to keep me providing for your lifestyle." "It wasn't all a lie," she protested. "I do love you, Dad. You're my father, and that will never change." "Love isn't just a word, Jessica. It's demonstrated through actions, through honesty, through respect. And your actions over the past year have shown me exactly how little you actually value our relationship beyond its financial benefits." Trevor stepped forward, his attitude shifting from defensive to aggressive. "Fine, you want to cut us off financially? Go ahead. We don't need your money. Jessica has a good job, I have a good job, and we'll make our own way without your help." "I'm glad to hear that," I replied, "because that's exactly what you're going to have to do." "What about the house down payment?" Jessica asked, her voice small and defeated. "What about it?" "We've been looking at houses and we found one we really like. The down payment is going to be about $100,000, and we thought—" "You thought you could manipulate me into providing it by using the same tactics that worked so well for the wedding expenses," I finished for her. "Well, you thought wrong." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Jessica alternating between tears and anger while Trevor became increasingly hostile as he realized that his plans for easy financial support had been permanently derailed. Eventually, they left my house without resolution, Jessica making vague threats about cutting me out of their lives, and Trevor muttering about ungrateful old men who didn't understand family loyalty. In the days that followed, I received several more phone calls from Jessica, each one representing a different approach to restoring her access to my financial resources. She tried guilt, reminding me of all the ways I had failed her as a single father and how I owed her compensation for her difficult childhood. She tried logic, arguing that family members should help each other and that my refusal to support their house purchase was selfish and unreasonable. She even tried bargaining, offering to include me more in their lives if I would reconsider my position on financial support. But I had heard enough. The casual cruelty of Trevor's comments at the wedding reception, the systematic nature of Jessica's emotional manipulation, and her continued attempts to extract money even after being confronted about her deception had convinced me that this relationship was beyond repair. I changed my phone number and had it unlisted. I hired a lawyer to send Jessica and Trevor a formal letter stating that any future contact should go through legal channels rather than directly to me. I accelerated my plans to sell my house in Cedar Ridge and move somewhere they couldn't find me easily. Most importantly, I completely revised my will and estate planning documents. Jessica's inheritance was reduced to a minimal amount, with the bulk of my assets designated for charitable organizations that would use the money to help people who genuinely need assistance rather than those who simply wanted to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. The process of disentangling myself from Jessica's life was more painful than I had anticipated. There were moments when I questioned whether I was being too harsh, whether I should give her another chance to prove that she could change. But each time I wavered, I remembered Trevor's laughter as he discussed my gullibility with his friends, and Jessica's calculated use of her mother's memory to manipulate my emotions. 6 months after the wedding, I sold my house in Cedar Ridge and moved to a small town in North Carolina where I could start fresh without the constant reminders of the daughter who had betrayed my trust and love. The mountains were different there. The people were unfamiliar, and my daily routine no longer included any connection to the family that had defined my identity for so many years. I never heard from Jessica again directly, though Helen occasionally provided updates on their situation. They had apparently managed to secure a mortgage for a house without a large down payment, taking on additional debt and a higher interest rate as a result. Trevor had been promoted at his software company, and Jessica had received a raise at her marketing firm, so they were managing financially without my support. Helen also mentioned that Jessica had asked about me several times, wondering where I had moved and whether I might be willing to reconcile. But these inquiries never came with acknowledgments of wrongdoing or attempts to make amends for the deception and manipulation.
They seemed more like attempts to determine whether I might still be accessible as a financial resource in the future. On the first anniversary of Jessica's wedding, I spent the day hiking in the North Carolina mountains, reflecting on how much my life had changed over the past year. The pain of losing my daughter to her own greed and dishonesty had gradually been replaced by a sense of freedom and self-respect that I hadn't experienced in years. I had learned to live for myself, rather than as a resource for others to exploit. I had discovered interests and friendships that had nothing to do with my ability to provide financial support. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my dignity and refused to allow myself to be manipulated by people who claimed to love me while treating me as nothing more than a source of funding for their lifestyle. The wedding I had paid for, the perfect celebration that had cost me $70,000 and revealed the true nature of my relationship with my daughter, had ultimately become the catalyst for the most important decision of my later life. By stopping payment on that venue and refusing to continue funding Jessica's manipulation, I had chosen self-respect over the illusion of family harmony. Margaret would have been proud of me for finally standing up for myself, for refusing to allow our daughter to continue exploiting my grief and love for her own selfish purposes. The woman who had taught me about dignity and integrity would have understood that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable their child's destructive behavior. As I watched the sunset paint the North Carolina mountains in shades of gold and amber, I felt grateful for the painful lesson that Jessica's wedding had taught me. It had cost me a daughter, but it had returned to me something even more valuable, my self-respect, and the knowledge that I deserved better than to be treated as a financial resource by the people I loved most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.